Good afternoon. I'd like to call the Finance Ways and Means Committee to order for January 23rd. Mr. Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Representatives Barrett, Boyd, Camper, Cochran, Crawford, Faison, Freeman, Gant, Garrett, Hawk, Hicks of Hawkins, Hicks of Washington, Kiesling, Lamberth, Love, Lynn, McKenzie, Miller, Moon, Parkinson, Shaw, Sparks, Whitson, Williams, Zachary, Vice Chairman Baum, Chair Lady Hazelwood.
Here.
Madam Chair Lady, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Before we get underway, are there any personal orders or announcements from the group? Seeing none, I want to thank the committee members for your participation, for your presence during our budget hearings a few weeks ago. And I think you all have received in your office via email the schedule for the upcoming budget hearings. We will begin those on Wednesday, February the 7th. Our targeted completion date is Monday, March the 11th. And you do, as I said, you have a copy of that schedule in your email if you haven't seen it already. Just a reminder, one of the responsibilities as a finance committee member is to attend all of the department and agency budget hearings. I know particularly as we move further into the um, session that we have a lot of calls and things that would or could produce conflicts, and sometimes those are unavoidable, but I would ask that everybody make every effort to be here. It's not only part of your duty as a member, but the information that we get from these hearings will help us to make better decisions as we move forward in the budgeting process. So again, I would respectfully request that all of you would be present and accounted for with smiling, happy faces for all of the upcoming budget hearings. I also want to take this time to go over our policies and procedures, only to say that they really haven't changed. This is the second year of the session, so we have the same policies and procedures for the committee as we had. There are a couple of changes. However, I just said there were no changes. There are a couple. The We have always asked, or for a while, we have asked for testimony from guest speakers. We had to be notified of that with a request in writing. Those can now be submitted online to my office, so you can do that electronically now. And again, there was a change in rules that applies to all committees, which also obviously applies to this one. And that's pursuant to the House Rule 83, subsection 20, that members presenting a bill before the committee will be limited to 5 minutes for their initial presentation. So again, that is just simply applying the same rule in this committee that is applied in others. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome new members and staff. We have a new member who's joined us and is so excited to hear about these budget hearings. Representative Tim Hicks, we're so glad to have you. We have a new intern this year in my office, Baxter Yarbrough, who's a Vanderbilt graduate student, already got a couple of degrees under his belt. So just to make sure that you're as respectful as you should be of him and his qualifications, we welcome him on board. And our new clerks for this year are Mason Hiskey and John Culverhouse. So, and the rest of our staff is our able staff. We're glad to see that back with us, nobody deserted over the interim period. So, welcome to new and returning staff members. With that, we have a presentation today. We don't have any bills in front of us yet. It's early days. So we do have a presentation from our friends at F&A and the Department of Revenue. So without objection, we will go out of session and we will ask Commissioner Bryson to talk with us about the budgetary outlook. And we have extra tissues up here if anybody needs those as we're get this information, try to it's sad, but it's not awful. So Commissioner Bryson, if you will just please kick it off for us.
Well, it's not what it used to be, but it's not what it has been recently, but it may be closer to what it used to be. It depends on how long you've been here. Thank you, Madam Chair, lady, members of the committee. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here with you today. We really appreciate you inviting us to present today on the revenue outlook for the upcoming FY25 budget. I have with me at the table today Budget Director David Thurman, who I know everybody is very familiar with, as well as Revenue Commissioner David Garagano, to present to you the budget outlook. Today, we would like to present an overview of where we are with the budget, some specific challenges that we face, and how well prepared Tennessee is for whatever challenges may lay ahead. Overall, the fundamentals of our economy remain good and seem to be improving a little bit, according to some economists. However, it's clear that the high tax revenue growth of the last few years is behind us. We are returning to a period of normal to slow growth that is more historically typical than the budget growth of the past few years. As you remember, we recently experienced budget growth north of 10% per year. That is significantly higher than the historic budget growth of around 3% annually. In some ways, the economy and our budget are coming back down to earth. We do expect much slower budget growth in the coming year for many reasons, some of which are listed here. This is the environment in which the Funding Board met last November. As is our custom, in November, the Funding Board received growth forecasts from 4 economic experts: UT's Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research, our own Department of Revenue, the Fiscal Review Committee, and ETSU Economics. This slide shows their forecasts and our budget estimates. Let's look at the top table first. As you can see, in July, the revenue growth estimate was revised to 3.77% for FY24, which is our current budget year that we are in right now. The second column shows the economist's forecast in November for the remainder of FY24. They generally provided a very modest growth forecast, with the consensus being growth below about 2%. The right-hand column shows the revised targets adopted by the Funding Board for our budget in FY24 of negative 0.5 to 0%. For budget planning, we are assuming 0% growth for the remainder of FY24. The bottom half of this slide shows similar data for FY25, the upcoming fiscal year for which we are now building a budget. As you can see in the middle column, the economist forecasts were mixed, but generally favored slower revenue growth in FY25. The Funding Board adopted a projection of negative 0.5 to 0.5% growth for this upcoming budget year. For budgeting, we are following historic practice and assuming a 0.5% growth budget for FY25. This slide shows how the estimates have compared to actual collections over the years. There are 3 takeaways from this slide that I'd like to highlight. First, note that our general fund revenue is significantly higher than it was in 2019. Though growth is slowing, we do not anticipate losing the ground that we have gained over the past few years. Second, note that the actual general fund revenues have typically been higher than the estimates. This is a tribute to the conservative estimates of the Funding Board and the conservative practical budgeting of the General Assembly. This is one reason Tennessee is in excellent financial condition, even with slowing growth. You can clearly see that our general fund growth has flattened in the past couple of years, and that our growth estimates of the past 2 years have been slightly higher than actual growth. Because of a history of conservative budgeting, we have been able to fill those gaps without dipping into any of our reserves or cutting into the base budget. Now let's take a look at the impact of the Funding Board's revised FY24 and FY25 estimates. In FY24, the current fiscal year, we began with a $19.8 billion tax revenue budget for the general fund. After the November Funding Board meeting, the growth estimate was revised to 0% growth, leaving a $718 million gap in the current year's budget. We are able to fill that gap because of our history of conservative budgeting that I referred to a moment ago. Basically, we have socked away recurring funds by spending them on non-recurring items, thus making them available for situations like these. The resulting FY25 growth estimate is for 0.5% growth, which will generate $95 million in new funds available for the upcoming budget year. Given that, let's take a look at where we are today. We are experiencing a mix of slow positive and negative growth, resulting in a fairly flat tax revenue projections. Remember that sales taxes are approximately 60% of our tax revenue. They are currently growing at just over 1% year to date. Also remember that we had 3 months of a tax holiday this fall that put a damper on sales tax collections. We estimate that actual growth adjusted for the grocery tax holidays is about 3.5% in the sales tax. This provides some confidence that sales taxes will hit the 1.94% revised annual growth estimate shown here. Franchise and excise taxes account for approximately 20% of our tax revenue, about $1 in $5. They are down significantly at a negative 12.7%. This is driven by lower estimated payments from our Tennessee businesses and significantly higher requests for refunds. We will discuss this more in a few minutes. The road taxes are growing, but have not generally kept up with construction inflation. Other taxes consist of a basket of items, but the decline is driven by the slowdown in the real estate market. Because sales taxes continue to grow, we expect some improvement in our tax collections from the 1.39% today to near flat growth by the end of the fiscal year. I want to emphasize that we are in good financial condition. As the budget has grown significantly over the past few years, we have not gone all California with our spending. We have been conservative and careful. The state remains in good fiscal condition as long as we remain diligent in continuing our history of conservative budget management. This year, we do face an additional revenue challenge that will impact our budget. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Commissioner Garrett Garagano from the Department of Revenue to explain.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Chair Lady Hazelwood, and committee members. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. Madam Chair Lady, our department and tax experts at the Attorney General's office have identified a significant legal risk in the way the franchise tax is currently structured, which could be extremely costly to Tennessee taxpayers. To allay those risks, we've advised the administration to consider changes to the franchise tax. As this committee knows, F&E comprises 2 taxes. The excise tax, which is about 2/3 of F&E collections, is based on net profit and is not at issue here. The franchise tax, which comprises the other 1/3 of F&E collections, is primarily a tax on net worth, meaning assets minus liabilities on the balance sheet. However, from the time the franchise tax was first enacted in 1935, it has always included a floor, which is to say that the tax base or the amount subject to tax will never be less than the amount of real and tangible property that is located in the state and used by the taxpayer. This is sometimes referred to as the property measure. Generally, other states with a franchise tax do not have a property measure like we have in Tennessee. Most recently, North Carolina repealed its property measure in 2022. Additionally, the significant risk that I mentioned at the outset is a pending legal challenge resulting from the property measure. The challenge is currently in the form of refund claims, but it puts the state at risk of litigation. To address those risks, the Department of Revenue and tax experts at the AG's office have advised the administration to consider changes to the franchise tax structure. The administration is proposing legislation to remove the alternative property measure going forward and provide refunds to companies that have paid franchise tax based on property during the open refund period. This is intended to solve the issue while at the same time providing tax relief to companies that have invested in our state. And with that, I'll pass it back to Commissioner Bryson.
Right. Thank you, Commissioner. If it's okay, we will have plenty of time for questions afterwards, if that is all right. Appreciate that. But the question is, so what's the budget impact? Because of the revenue growth over the past few years and our conservative spending approach, Tennessee is well prepared to address this issue, even though we are in a slow growth year. As you recall, for the past few years, we have intentionally used a growing amount of recurring revenues on non-recurring expenses. From FY22 to FY24, recurring revenue spent on non-recurring expenses has grown from $234 million to $2.6 billion. The $2.6 billion represents tax revenue we expect to collect for which we have no matching recurring expenses. This revenue can be used to address the budget challenges we face today. Tennessee is well prepared and fiscally strong. Also, as you remember, the Rainy Day Fund remains at historic highs. We have over $2 billion in the fund, well above the 8% statutory goal. We have no expectation of using the Rainy Day Fund in FY24 or the upcoming FY25 budget, or making any unanticipated reductions in the base budget. As you know, debt service can be a significant financial drag for some states, not Tennessee. Over the last 10 years, you and your predecessors have continually worked to reduce debt. Today, Tennessee's debt service burden is less than half of what it was 10 years ago and remains one of the lowest in the country. In summary, Tennessee tax revenue has experienced extraordinary growth over the last 3 years. We have responded by spending it wisely and saving it for a rainy day in the form of building reserves and spending recurring revenues on non-recurring expenses. Along the way, we paid down debt and kept Tennessee in a strong financial position that gives us options when presented with unexpected challenges. Our overall economy and tax collections have slowed, especially from the recent high growth years, but we expected that and we are ready. The adjustment of our franchise tax presents a significant financial challenge. Though we did not expect it, we are ready for that too. We have the ability and resources to address this challenge this year without tapping any reserves or cutting the base budget. We will face this issue head on for FY25 and look forward to a more normal year in FY26. In closing, I want to thank you, your predecessors, and my predecessors for the consistently conservative budgeting of years past. We are prepared to weather the speed bumps ahead because of these careful, responsible, and conservative decisions that have been a consistent hallmark of Tennessee financial planning. Thank you for the opportunity to come and to present to you, and we will be more than happy to take whatever questions that you may have.
Well, thank you both commissioners for that presentation. We do have a number of questioners on the list. There's a lot to digest in what you've presented and a lot for this committee to think about as we move forward with this budgeting process. First on my list is Representative McKenzie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of questions. The first deals with we're looking at the projections, and I'm not making any disparaging statement toward any institution, but when I look at the Boyd Center, Department of Revenue, Fiscal Review, and East Tennessee State, looks like ETSU, have they consistently been kind of way off? They're, significantly off the other numbers. Why is that? And they're consistently like that. Why are we still using that number?
So that is, we don't know exactly what all their methods were. We haven't delved into that. We can talk to them and find out for you if that's something you'd like to have. What we did was we went back and looked at all four. The reason we get four is so that we can get, because economists differ in their opinion about what's going to happen in the future. So it was important for us to get more than one, and we got four, and then we came up with a consensus. The funding board, which consists of myself and the three constitutional officers, came up with what we would consider to be a consensus using the economic data. The ETSU numbers were different than the others. We believe that they were maybe using a different methodology, but since all the other three were relatively close, we felt pretty comfortable with that.
Representative McKenzie, have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate you all and appreciate you all taking that conservative approach. Like I said, looking at those numbers, they just seem to be way off. I guess I'll put it in two questions into one and make it my last. What basis are you all using to say that you think the tax dollars are going to be steady? I know you talked about a slowing growth, but when I'm looking at 23, 24, 25, 25 actually looks a little lower than 23. So I guess my question is, what evidence do you have that we're going to stay at that $19 billion number and then not slow back down to where we are in 22 or pre-COVID? So that's one question. And my last one is, and that may be to you, is for the franchise taxes. It looks like you all are saying that decline is going to slow, but you're giving breaks. I just need to further understand how we can improve and we're giving bigger breaks to our businesses. So you answer those two. Thank you.
Okay, I'll answer the first one, I guess, and let you take the second one. So we're going back to the funding board estimates. When the funding board estimates, the consensus was that it would be about zero growth, which means so therefore the budget was going to become flat, relatively flat with zero growth. And so the reason we don't think it's going to dip down below the 19.8 is because we're projecting it to stay steady. Could it? Possible. It's possible, and we'll have contingencies for that, but we expect it to stay flat based on all the economist numbers.
Representative McKenzie, in response to your second question, I would just say that the proposal, the reason for bringing the franchise tax bill is precipitated by in response to the significant legal risk from a potential litigation challenge. Now, it does have the effect of providing tax relief to companies who are locating their property here, but it has been brought about by the legal risk that's been presented.
Representative Gant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, thank you all for being here today. Can you describe, I've had a lot of people in my district ask me this question, and I hadn't really had a good answer, I guess, is first of all, how much money do we have in our rainy day fund? What's the current?
It's just over $2 billion. I think it's $2.05 billion, I think.
Can you describe a day where we would tap into that, what that day would look like from our economy perspective?
Do you have an answer? I can try.
Well, so I think the law is pretty, I'm David Thurman, Director of the Budget Office. The law is pretty clear that we can use it for two things. One, to shore up unexpected expenditures that we don't know after the budget's been enacted, and then to help achieve a revenue estimate that was not realized. And so those are the kind of the two uses.
I didn't hear you. Say that one more time.
To use it to cover an unrealized revenue estimate after the budget's already set. So a shortfall.
So a budget shortfall.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chairman Williams.
Thank you, Commissioner, gentlemen, for being here today. Always good to see the two gentlemen flanking your side. They were here before us, and I'm sure they'll probably be here after us. So I appreciate their wisdom and direction. Part of the success where we are today is because of the tenure of our state employees in these positions. So for that, we're thankful. I did have a couple questions about the $1.2 billion that we talked about, and as far as repayment plan as it relates to the F&E tax. The question about that is that where would that money come from to pay those taxes? Are we, as Representative Gant may have suggested, are we talking about spending those from rainy day funds or from cash reserves or?
So that's part of what the reason I was talking about the $2.6 billion that we have, last year we spent recurring revenue on non-recurring expenses. So what that means is since it's recurring revenue, we have that revenue again this year, since we're expecting flat growth rates. So we'll have that revenue coming in and we'll be able to pay out of that $2.6 billion, we'll be able to pay the refunds that you were referring to.
So those will be paid for out of the 24-25 budget document that will be paid for out of the $2.6 million in billion.
Well, in the FY25 budget, when those revenues recur, those, we can budget them wherever we need to budget them. And one place that we will budget them is to a non-recurring refund fund that will be set aside to pay these F&E refunds.
Right. Chair Lady, may I continue? Thank you. As it relates to these revenues, do you expect that these businesses will calculate their estimated F&E tax based upon the law that we're being presented by the administration? Or do you think they're going to continue to pay based upon the current statute, therefore impacting this fiscal year and not next?
You mean, or you want to take it?
It's up to you.
Well, I think I'll speak, and if he has anything to add, because we're still working on exactly what the guidance will be on that, because there's a couple of different ways to do that, and part of that is budget related. Matter of fact, we have a meeting after this to talk through what that guidance will be for taxpayers. So we're still working through what that looks like.
Is there an expectation that the projections that you've discussed here today might be dramatically different because of the way they estimate their F&E tax at the end of this year versus what the new law would mean for the next year, though?
It could be somewhat different, I believe. It just depends on how we, what the guidance from the Department of Revenue is on how they fill out their taxes for the year.
Finally, as it relates to those F&E taxes, do you expect that those individuals, whether in this fiscal year or next fiscal year, will select to choose to pay their estimated tax based upon a credit instead of with the department or the state, instead of paying their F&E tax when they're due? Because I think we rely upon the business to tell us what their estimated and pay what their estimated F&E tax will be.
Yeah, certainly. We do rely, we receive estimated payments through, as you know, throughout the current year. Businesses make a determination as to how much they want to pay in. There's a lot of factors that go into those decisions, I think, on their end. Part of that is your estimated payment can be based on your prior year liability. That's sort of a safe harbor, or it can be based on what you think you're going to owe in the current year, which is a little less certain for that taxpayer. So some are more conservative and they'll always make estimated payments on the prior year. Others will do differently. I think there's a lot of factors that go into those decisions. Some of which are tax factors and some of which are other business factors. So it's sort of notoriously hard to predict how people are going to respond with their estimated payments, particularly with a bill that's passed after the year has started. Some have sort of scheduled out their estimated payments for that year. Will they choose to change that schedule based on the bill passing? You know, it's sort of business by business and hard to predict to what extent they will do that or not do that. So that's one of the things that sort of makes F&E somewhat volatile and somewhat hard to forecast on a year-to-year basis, because there's a lot of business decisions in the tax department. And of course, we're dealing with it from a small business to the largest corporations. You know, there's a lot that goes into how they decide to make their estimated payments. But what's important to know is we do estimate payments are collections, as I think you know, when they come in, and then that's trued up when they file their tax return. But even then, they have the option of, if they have made estimated payments that exceed their final liability, they have the option of taking that as a refund at that time, in which case it's basically a negative collection, or carrying that balance forward to the next year, in which case it does not affect collections at that time. It's just carried forward as you reference credits. So that's what makes F&E really dynamic. There's a lot going on all at the same time.
Yep. I thank you for your answer. My concern is that we'll be carrying negative balances year over year. It might be interesting that if we, in the legislation, that we speak directly how those should be accommodated. It's rare, even in 2013, I think, when we had a budget shortfall when I was here, very painful to figure out. And at the time, the F&E tax was something that really challenged the legislature because we were trying to figure out exactly what our shortfall was in that fiscal year, but we didn't know because the F&E taxes were so volatile. My concern is that in trying to do good and pay a bill that's not really due with $1.2 billion, that we might find ourselves at a greater liability. It just I think it's very unusual, and I'm quite concerned about the idea of paying back 3 years of credits or taxes on a bill that's not been due, that we've been collecting this way for decades. And so I don't think, from my perspective, I don't think our departments or our state is at fault for the way they've been doing it, because everyone's been doing it that entire time. And so I think it's something, for lack of better terms, we've kind of revealed ourselves at this point. I don't know how to put the toothpaste back in the tube, but I think at the end of the day, this legislation should stand for itself, and we should go forward as it relates to making it right with businesses as they go forward. So I hope we'll consider that as we look at a remedy going forward in our meetings.
Yes, sir. One thing I should say, and this is really not to speak to your overall point, but just to make sure I'm providing the committee with good information about the process. There are years that have already been, the estimated payments have been made, the returns have been filed, and they're within the open refund period, but they've already been trued up, so to speak. And if the bill passes and it provides for refunds for those years, we've drafted the bill such that folks will need to file a specific refund claim outside of the normal process so they can be paid from this fund. And we anticipate issuing checks to all of those people. There would be no provision for them to carry that as a credit. In other words, for those specific refunds, they would request that, and we would cut them a check, and it would be done. There would be no carrying that forward. There is the 23 year, the year that just ended, where returns have not been filed yet, and that's part of what Commissioner Bryson was alluding to. We're still working through how that year will be handled.
Chairman Williams?
Thank you. I don't mean to monopolize the time, but I want to reiterate that, if you had a property tax problem and you wanted to go back and you were overcharged for that, there was a mechanism by which to do that. In this instance, to use your words, these businesses have trued up their ledgers in those previous years based upon what the statute was at that time. To summarily go back and write checks of credit back when we and they both acted in good faith, I think is concerning. And I'm yet to be sold on the idea that we should do that. Do we want to fix it going forward? Absolutely. I think we all do. But I don't think we should really look at the idea of writing checks because everyone had trued up and followed the statute to the best of our ability up to this point.
Chairman Hicks?
Thank you, Chair, ladies and gentlemen. Certainly good to see you all here. I want to go back just a little bit because back in August in the special session, F&A came and gave a presentation. And at that time, there was going to be a $330 million shortfall just to close the books on fiscal year 23. So at that time, F&A stated that the way that this gap was going to be filled was going to be some reversions. And so I'm just curious to find out a little bit, how did we close that gap? So I know when I look at reversions, you look at TennCare with $703 million, mental health $58.7 million, education $163.8 million, TDOC $191 million. So I'm curious to see what reversions were used to fill the gap, and then why are these so high? Is my other question. So I know that's a little bit packed in there, but certainly
Yeah, so you're right. It was $330 million was the shortfall for 23. And to close the gap, really two things. It was agency underspending. And so you're spot on the reversion issues. And I think you named the top reversion agencies, I guess. So TennCare, Correction, I'm trying to blank now. I haven't looked at it in some-
Education, mental health.
Not as much there, but TennCare for sure. And it has a lot to do with TennCare because of the enhanced FMAP and the way we have prepared for the redetermination effort. So we had set aside the dollars necessary to do that. And so we continue to get the enhanced FMAP. And so we benefited from that with our extraordinary reversion. And we also had some non-tax revenues, and the big one there is the interest earnings on the state pooled investment fund. Interest rates are incredibly high, and we had, I think, about $771 million in interest earnings. 4 or 5 years ago, it was 3.7. So it's very volatile, but it's a product of the large balance and the large interest rates that we're able to achieve right now. So those two things combined to help us close the gap. And also gave us a balance to carry forward. So,
Okay, and just curious, those reversions seem, again, really high. What's maybe going on there?
So product of continued vacancy issues. A good part of that is result of the agency reversion. And I think too, maybe the federal dollars that we've had for are working their way out, and we've been able to on some cases swap those out to cover some expenses that would normally be covered from state. So that's kind of a one-time extraordinary savings that occurred there. It's a combination of a lot of things, and I don't have the entire list in front of me, but I can walk through that later if you want.
Okay, thank you much. And I won't steal any more time. I guess I'll just say, as Chairman Williams said, very concerned about the F&E. While, the picture, I guess, has not been painted entirely doom and gloom, there's certainly quite a bit of gloom there. And so certainly look forward to, talking about this issue, and not only going forward, but certainly going back as well. So I appreciate your all's time. Again, certainly look forward to having much more discussion on that. Thank you all. Thank you, Chair Lane.
And just a reminder to the committee, we will be having budget hearings for each of these departments where we can really drill down into this reversion issue, because they are extraordinary numbers. And just if you go back and look at past numbers, and this is a huge bump in that number. So we will have an opportunity as those departments are in front of us. I hope everybody will remember that reversions is something that we really want to get a lot more information about. Next on my list, Chairman Baum.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to ask you one more question about interest earnings. The state received almost $4 billion from the federal government in COVID-related funds. We didn't spend all that money all at once. The part that wasn't spent was invested, and we've received some earnings on that investment. I feel like I remember last year in our appropriations amendment, we recognized that and used some of that money in last year's budget. And so I guess my first question is, are we planning, are we able to earn interest on some of the remaining unspent federal COVID money? And if so, are we planning to recognize that and use that to meet a portion of this shortfall?
We for that particular federal award, we get it in advance, and we are allowed to earn interest on it, and that is happening. And we are going to recognize that. You did recognize some of that in your amendment. I think 50 million of it to fund, and it's a product of, again, the interest earnings are a product of the balance, and it's still working its way down. And so we're going to recognize as part of our budget proposal some earnings from that as well.
Okay, that's good. And my last question has to do with maybe finding out a little bit more about your perspectives on what may be causing or have caused revenue shortfalls. My impression is states all across the country are experiencing decreases in revenue. And the two reasons I hear about, I guess, as being the two main culprits are, number one, there's a decrease in federal funding as COVID-related funding ends. And the other one is a number of states have cut taxes, and those two things together have resulted in revenue decreases. But those are expected events. We should know when federal funding is going to begin tapering off. We should know how tax cuts that have been passed will affect future revenues. Our revenue shortfall here has to be explained by an unexpected event, something that we didn't foresee in our projection. And so I was just curious as to what you would attribute these decreases to, maybe above and beyond decreases in federal funding and tax cuts. And then maybe if I had to add something else, knowing that the economy seems to be approaching a soft landing after interest rates have been raised to combat inflation. So just any perspectives you might have that you could share with us on that.
I think you're talking about these numbers here with the revenue. So the sales taxes are doing fairly, I mean, it's slow growth, but it's growth. It's not falling off. The big problem that we're having right now is primarily in F&E, which is falling off. And as I think Commissioner Giordano talked about, it's a lot. There's different estimates that are coming in. There's also refunds that are going out. So he may be able to speak more on that, but the F&E taxes is the one that's about what, 20% of our total tax base, and it's going down somewhat. The other taxes that are on there are really made up of primarily real estate taxes and privilege taxes that are in that. As we know, the real estate market is not what it was, and we're comparing this to pretty robust years. So it's gone down a little bit compared to very robust years. But we're down about 1.4%. So we're not seeing tremendous fall offs. We are seeing in revenue, we are seeing obviously some fall offs in federal spending, some federal dollars coming in, but it's not really affecting our budget terribly because we didn't spend those dollars in ways that are recurring and ongoing. And so we haven't, I don't think that's, I'd be corrected, but I don't think that's created a real problem for us when those ARPA dollars and others don't come in the way they did a year or two ago.
Okay, thank you.
And just to follow up while we're talking about ARPA dollars, one of the things that's concerning to me is the speed at which those dollars are being expended. I think we're on track as I'm looking at the dashboard. The allocations are, pretty much on track, but we are not getting the money out the door. The last dashboard, and I watched the Senate hearing, so I know that there's some new numbers coming towards the end of this month, maybe toward the end of this week even. But, we only have spent 6.6% of the $3.7 billion. And, there's a hard deadline on expending those monies. If they aren't gone by the end of 2026, then, we've lost them.
Mm-hmm.
I have particular concerns, and I've shared with TDEC, and they promised me that they're looking into some of the reasons that funding has not taken place as it has in sister states surrounding us. They've been able to get, money in the ground with sewers and water lines and that sort of thing that we still are in the process of thinking about. So just, can you help me make me feel better that we're actually going to meet the goal of spending this money? Because I think, to the credit of this committee, this General Assembly, the governor's office, the FSAG process, I think it really was a good process. And we spent a lot of time and effort making sure that we were allocating those dollars in ways that would impact the state positively for the future. Hence the focus on things like the sewer and water lines and those kinds of things. And if we lose this opportunity because we simply were so caught up in our bureaucratic process, we couldn't get the dollars out the door, well, then shame on us. So make me feel better, Commissioner.
Well, first of all, I want to agree with you on the fact that I think the process that the committee did to get those dollars out in ways that were beneficial to the state over the long term and were by the vast majority non-recurring so that we don't have problems down the road with fiscal cliffs, I think was a terrific process. And and you all did a wonderful job in managing that process. It looks like I've got a little bit of information that may be updated from what you have, Madam Chair Lady. It looks like at least we've got a lot of it obligated. The wastewater project is about $1 billion out of the 1.3 billion is obligated. Now, I know that you're talking about being spent, right? So we still have a ways to go. I don't have numbers on being spent. I will tell you two things, and one is that there is the quarterly report using data from the end of the year will be distributed to your office for this committee within the next 2 weeks. So you'll have that information. And the other thing is that we're tracking this pretty closely too, and watching to make sure that we stay ahead of these deadlines. I believe from what I am being told that we are in pretty good shape on that. And if we get to a point where we are not in good shape, we will pull some of that money back and reallocate it.
Well, I do, one of the concerns that I have is if we wait till the proverbial last minute
Right.
to actually get the dollars out the door, then every minute we wait, the costs are going up. We're going to be able to buy less with the dollars that we have. In addition to that, again, our sister states have entered into contracts. There are just so many contractors and suppliers out there who can do this kind of work. And, I'm really concerned, not only will it up the cost, but we might not even be able to find people to get the projects in the ground and complete on time. So I just think I would urge your department, and I would urge every member on this committee to really pay attention to that, particularly in projects that have been obligated that would be in your districts. Just kind of ride herd on how those are going, because we don't want to be here this time next year and say we still have less than 50% of this money spent, and we have less than a year to get it done. So again, just raising that flag of concern for you all. Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. My question had been answered, but if you don't mind, I want to take a point of personal privilege to introduce my intern, if you will. If you'll stand up, brother, is Carnell White. Is our intern this year out of Tennessee State University from Cincinnati, Ohio. And I also want to congratulate my colleague to my left for making it to the promised land down here on Democrats Row. Thank you.
I thought you were going to congratulate your colleague on better sartorial choices today, but Chairman Hawk, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Fun crew we've got here today. I want to address a little bit, one of the concerns from the gentleman from Knoxville was about the ETSU forecast that were held. And just to relay, we're naturally optimistic folks in our part of Northeast Tennessee. So we're naturally optimistic. And just to address the professor's question and thought about the slowing of revenue, I have to think that in some terms, the slowing of the sales tax portion of the revenue may be directly related to a slowing of inflation of cost of goods. Since we are naturally, the majority of income that we see is from sales tax on goods, that as inflation hopefully has slowed down, that there's an organic indexing that's part of this cost of goods go up, the sales tax is going to increase as well. So that may be part of why we're seeing a natural slowing of the sales tax as well. I do want to, again, heap some praise on this body for the recurring versus non-recurring nature of funding that we have been very thoughtful in doing. And a lot of capital projects are out there being funded now that we're going to be able to recognize those revenues going forward for recurring expenses. So kudos to that. My question gets back to slide number 7, and we've talked a lot about the franchise tax aspect and what we're doing. I want to hear from you how we prepare our local governments for this, because these business taxes are also part of, in many cases, part of their revenue stream. So how do we prepare our local governments for the understanding of these F&E taxes going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually not. Representative Hawk, thank you for the question. That is typically a bigger issue in sales tax. With F&E, there is a portion that goes locally referred to as the bank excise tax. Fortunately, in this scenario, that's on the excise tax side based on net income. So that's not touched by this. This is only on franchise tax. So I don't think there's really any revenue from this particular component of F&E that's going to locals.
Okay, very helpful. Thank you. Thank you for the answer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Leader Lambert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And as we talk about this, Commissioner and your team, thank you very much for the hard work you put in. It's extremely difficult labor that you guys do, and we appreciate that and partner with you in that. I did want to let the members know that House Bill 1893 is the bill we're talking about on franchise and excise tax. It has already been filed. So as that bill comes through the committee system and potentially, makes its way to this committee, if it does, then that will be the bill number that you can look at for the details of it. I'm not as concerned of the legal risk. We've had this out there for 90 years, but at the same time, from a policy standpoint, we're one of the few states that still does the franchise aspect of this. To me, it just seems like the right thing to do to continue to make Tennessee competitive, but I share my colleagues' concerns. And as we go through this, I know we'll talk about the different fiscal implications of that to make sure that we continue to set Tennessee up well for the future. So, Commissioner, what I'm kind of hearing from you is that, this will be the first year in several years that we need to significantly tighten our belt. We're always very careful with the people's money and spend it wisely, and we're very careful about letting the budget just grow. But this is one of those years that we need to focus on correcting. Is that fair enough?
Thank you, Leader. I think that's exactly right. And I appreciate you saying it much more succinctly than I did. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Chairman Williams, you had another question, I believe.
Yeah, gentlemen, just to follow up on the revenue projections, when we revised the estimate for revenue projections, if you look back at what that decision was, knowing what we know now, would we revise revenue projections, or would we have met the projections if we hadn't revised them, I guess is the question.
I'm sorry, are you asking if we would have met the previous projections?
Yes.
No, we would not, because the projections were revised downward.
Okay.
So when they were revised, then we revised them downward because of the economy, the economic news that we had had since the previous projections.
Okay. Finally, about the projections, based upon our previous behaviors, it seemed as though we conservatively left our projections low, which is what allowed us to generate these recurring revenues over time. I guess it's one way really to put reserves in the bank. I guess my question to you is how reliable do you believe those funding projections to be when they've been so volatile based upon what we set the projections at, what they've actually attained, and what we're doing now? It seems like that when you look at the revenue projections, they've increased dramatically over a short period of time, but when you look at the years before that, they're pretty much leveled out based upon what they were before. I guess my question is do you expect, you already said you expected it to be pretty level going forward, but is really the additional revenue that we have because our projections were, for lack of a better term, super conservative instead of just typically what we saw on the slide?
Yeah, I'll share a quick story with you, and that goes to that. I've been fortunate enough the last couple of years to go talk to the bond rating agencies in New York, and what I've come to realize is because the funding board is so conservative in their projections for growth, because they get these economists to project the economy, and then the funding board usually goes below that, right? Because they're being conservative. Because of that, we have had, that's one of the reasons why I think we have a AAA bond rating, is because of our historic conservatism on how we budget. So I expect that we will be in good shape, and that we may outperform what we're already projecting. That's the hope anyway, but we're still very conservative in the projections.
And a follow-up point on that, when we first started talking about these additional monies that we chose not to recognize as recurring, one of the arguments for treating those dollars that way was that we really didn't know, with the big influx of federal monies that were coming in, it was really hard to tell what would be recurring and what would not be. I mean, sales tax, for instance, people were buying refrigerators and sofas and things that you don't buy on an annual basis. So I guess, how confident are we that those dollars that we weren't certain enough in the beginning to classify them as non-recurring, So how confident can we be that they truly are recurring and we will not have a shortfall based after we use these monies in these other projected or potential ways?
Yeah, I remember, thank you. I remember those conversations about durable goods and whether that was going to cause a blip in our sales tax. The good news is that what we have experienced is I think the number was about a 1.5% growth in our sales tax revenues so far this year. And that includes the 3-month grocery tax elimination. So if you actually kind of normalize that and push it back up and say, well, if we didn't have the grocery tax, what would it be? It would be about 3 or 3.5% growth in our sales tax, which is getting closer to what a normal growth year looks like. And so we're seeing that growth this year, even though we don't have all of those durable goods and everything that we talked about when interest rates were really low.
All right, we will hold on to that thought. Leader Camper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Commissioner, for your presentation. I think we can see here that there's a lot of bipartisan support for really looking at this franchise excise proposal that you're bringing about. A lot of us are concerned about it. But I did have a question. I think I heard in your presentation with respect to that there was concern for significant risk and that there was a pending lawsuit. Is there a pending lawsuit, or what was that I heard about a lawsuit?
I mean, it's currently in the form of refund claims. There is risk of litigation if those are not resolved, but they're currently only refund claims.
Okay, so it's the refund claims that we're dealing with, and if that doesn't resolve itself, it could result in a lawsuit.
Yes.
And you're trying to get ahead of it with this proposal.
That's correct. Yeah, to be clear, there's no pending lawsuit.
Yeah, I was concerned about that. Okay, the other question I think was answered. You said that these refunds would go back 3 years. Did I hear that? How far back would the refunds go? I think I heard 3 years. I could be wrong.
Yeah, to speak sort of precisely, it's refund claims have to be, and this is current law, refund
Yeah.
claims have to be filed within 3 years of December 31st of the year in which the return was filed.
Mhm.
So it's sort of between 3 and 4 years, depending on when you filed your return.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. That was my question. But could I take another point of privilege here and recognize my intern, if she would stand up? Ashley Rising from TSU. She's a political science major. Thank you for being here.
Representative Love.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I guess I need to go ahead and recognize my intern. Carlos Wilson, Tennessee State University, political science major. All right, glad to have you here. Commissioner, my question about the possible refunds. Could you tell us how many, and if you can't at some point get us to us, what is the average amount we're looking at per company, and how many entities are we looking at?
We've received refund claims from in the neighborhood of 80 entities. Representative Love, we've received refund claims from approximately roughly 80 entities. I do not have sort of in front of me the average amount. I'd be happy to circle back with you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
80.
Yes.
Representative Garrett, who is so much better dressed today.
Wow, getting hammered. That's right. Thank you all for being here. I've got Leader Camper and some others have kind of asked a little bit about the F&E issues. Y'all said pending lawsuits, and I didn't think there was any filed, but here's my kind of my question as it relates to that, because obviously this has caught a lot of folks' attention. Y'all have had a lot of talk with some tax experts, some tax lawyers, I'm assuming with the AG, to come up with this resolution. So my question is actually, is it a resolution? You've got 80 claims now. Is this opening up a can of worms where there could be potentially another 180 that they may have 3 years for a refund? Because I think Leader Camper asked, this is in a refund status. So my assumption is these refunds have come in with staking their claim as why they're owed the refund on an 80-year, law that we've had on the books that have caused some grave concern that we might owe them back this. They can only go back 3 years currently because I'm assuming some sort of statute of limitations is out there. So my question is, one, will this resolve the issue where there's no more claims down the pipe if this passes and we're done with this because we're going to remodify? And the answer, I assume, is going to remodify or eliminate the franchise tax. And then secondly, are we opening up a can of worms where if someone can hear my voice right now and say, oh my gosh, I'm owed this money, I haven't filed a refund claim yet, that we can file more claims, and instead of having 80, you have 1,000? Kind of let me.
Yeah, thank you, Representative. So, there are never guarantees. I can't guarantee that if this bill passes, there will never be a lawsuit. I think this bill, though, would address the issue and would allow the state, if there were to be litigation, the state would be facing that litigation on terms that the state has chosen and be in a much better, stronger position than today. In essence, this legislation would represent the state choosing what the potential remedy would be. But I cannot guarantee that there's no taxpayer that would say there should be some other remedy and sue on that. But we would prefer, again, litigation is not guaranteed, or it's not guaranteed that it won't happen. But if it were to happen, this would allow us to approach that on our own terms.
One more.
May I speak to that real
Sure.
quickly?
Yeah.
Just because I think there may be a misperception. If there is, I just want to correct it. There's about 80 companies that have asked for a refund today. Once this legislation passes, others will be able to ask for refunds. Right? I just want to make sure that that's clear because I kind of felt like we were on the 80, that was the total universe.
Representative Garrett.
Thank you. And thank you for that clarification. So if any of these 80 claimants and any future claimants that come down the pipe accept the refund, I would assume that it absolves any potential litigation they could be had because they'll then would be made whole or be paid back whatever money they believe they're owed under the refund. In other words, does the legislation say if you accept the refund, you can't sue us?
No, it does not. It does not say that.
Is there any reason why that doesn't say that?
Well, I mean, I think this is, I think for the people who receive this refund, this is likely the greatest refund or remedy that they could achieve. So I don't think there's any incentive for the folks who are due and provided a refund under this legislation to ask for anything beyond that. Would be the intent and sort of what we anticipate with this legislation.
Representative Garrett.
Is there any reason why you can't get some sort of advice as to why? Because you give a mouse a piece of cheese, they're going to want a glass of milk. So if they come back and ask for more, they get something now. I'm afraid they're going to come back and ask for more, even though we've already given them a refund. And even though they may already be made whole for whatever they're seeking in an excessive franchise tax, that we're still opening up ourselves to any liability with those particular claimants. So I would hope that we can get some feedback to say, if they receive these refunds, I don't see why the legislation can't be amended to say, you're done. You're agreeing not to sue us.
Understood.
Is that reasonable?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry. We have a number of questioners left, and I think we have sort of exhausted this line of questioning. So I would ask if there are other areas of interest to please kind of focus on that. Leader Cochran, Chairman Cochran.
I'll take either. Chair Lady, thank you very much. So I am going to pivot to a different topic, and it's one that Chair Lady Hazelwood covered with you a little bit earlier. and so about the expenditure of American recovery funds. So I think we mentioned that maybe we have just expended about 6% or so. So I guess my question would be, what I would like from your department is, and I know you may not have the answer right this second, but at some point back to this committee, is why? Why has it compared to other states? Why have we been so slow? Because clearly something is different. Not even saying necessarily rightly or wrongly, but we've done something differently than other states, and so I'd like to know what that is. I know one thing that we implemented was, we brought in an outside auditing firm, I think with Ernst & Young, and I understand why we did that, right? You don't want to spend the funds improperly and then a local municipality or whoever have to pay the federal government back on the back end when you find out you didn't spend those properly. But ultimately, I guess my question is, I think we need to look at that, and is that the reason that we've been going so slowly, because we implemented that additional step on the front end? And do we need to do that differently next time if there is a next time? So you can offer a response to that now, but at some point I would like an answer to the question of why has it been so slow?
Yeah, we'll be glad to work on that, see if we can get it to you. We'll get this report of where we are, and then we'll get a report on why it may not be as fast as other states, which will include, which I don't have and maybe the committee has, is where other states are. I'm sure we can find it. I just simply don't have it today. And we'll find that and try to get you an answer to that question. Be glad to.
Okay, thank you and again, I think we want to look at that, and not necessarily opposed to having that firm on the front end, but I think we need to make sure, was that implemented in the most effective way? Thank you.
And I would ask that we have that sort of analysis, and maybe not just for next time, because we still have a couple of years in this process. And I know some of the folks who reached out to me with concerns about some of the projects I mentioned earlier, they really felt that the folks that we had to hire to make sure that we spent it correctly, that perhaps they didn't understand the state process as well as they should, and they were their bureaucracy and their requirements were really slowing down the ability of the local governments or development districts or whoever it might be to get the grants funded. So I really do think that that's something that somebody needs to dig down into and do it fairly quickly, because we cannot afford to be here, as I said, this time next year and still be looking at a large segment, a large percentage of those funds not having been spent, because you can't spend that much money in a year and spend it wisely and effectively. So I would just encourage that we have conversations with Ernst & Young and make sure that we want to do it correctly, and that's what have been hired to do, but we don't want them impeding the process either. So again, to Leader Cochran's point. Leader Lamberth, you're recognized again.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and to my good friend from Goodlettsville. I think it's, if you give a mouse a cookie, was the analogy he was trying for. Several in the room were thinking of that. And full disclosure, my kids are younger than his, so I've read that book more recently. So in all seriousness, back to the franchise and excise conversation for a moment, how many filers do we have statewide annually on that? And roughly how many will this bill affect as far as a refund and in the future a cut, roughly?
Yeah, so we have in the neighborhood of 250,000 F&E filers now. About 100,000 of those file the minimum, so it's really more like 150,000. Before the Works Act, about 70,000 paid on the minimum measure. After the Works Act, about 30,000 pay on the minimum measure. As far as the potential number of entities eligible for a refund per the statute, it's about 100,000. And so you might ask, well, if pre-Works Act, if only 70,000 filed based on property, why is the potential refund pool 100,000? It's because it's not the same 70,000 every year. So covering 3+ years, you end up at about 100,000 taxpayers.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Miller.
Madam Chair, thank you. It's pretty much been said. Most of my questions have been answered. But it's still somewhat confusing, going back to the franchise question and the proposed bill, which I personally think is pretty much in trouble at this point. But we can work through that. But the thing is, when you mention the potential loss of the federal dollars, and we're at 6%. I hate to beat a dead horse, but and we're soft pedaling right now. We have a responsibility as legislators up here, just as you all have a responsibility. And we're soft pedaling with this. We got to be very aggressive in making absolutely sure we do not end up sending those federal dollars back to the federal government, whereby we can help our citizens today. And you also mentioned, we have to be careful. Of course, we have to be careful, but we don't want to fall off the cliff. What does that even means, falling off the cliff? We don't have to fall off the cliff. We don't have to fall off any cliff. You got situations out here, and I'm just saying hypothetically, my colleagues just showed me again where we're $700 million in the black with TANF dollars right now. And years ago, we went back and said, wait a minute, we sitting on $700 million, $1 billion. We just sitting there waiting for the rainy day. We fixed the rainy day, $2 billion over and above what we should have. And we're still sitting here thinking, oh, wow, we got these dollars, but we can't seem to make it work. That's difficult to believe. It's frustrating. Let's make it work. Whatever our responsibilities, if as legislators, we need to give you what you need to make this thing work for the citizens of our state that are in dire need. They're suffering. And if you take all the poor people in this state, come on. Half of them don't have transportation to get out and go look for a job. Shit, what if we bought them lemons so they can get to work, look for some jobs? We talk about one of the biggest issues in this state, crime, especially coming out of Memphis and Shelby County. Our Chamber of Commerce just had the largest companies in Shelby County, from the FedEx, you name them, to sign off on a letter to say we want $50 million from the state of Tennessee to fight crime in our community because it's bad for business. I'm gonna sign off on that and say, no, $50 million is not enough. Let's put $1 billion in crime fighting in this state, because all the crime is not coming out of Memphis. Some of it is in your neighborhood, and my neighborhood. So let's stop playing around. And then all of a sudden we become the best in the country. We lead and others follow. Most of the things that are coming out of Tennessee, sometimes it's we're the first to do this. And usually it's the first to do the worst. Let's be the first to do the best sometimes. Charge it to my heart.
I don't have any further questions on my list. I know this is a complicated subject, and talking about a less rosy, I won't say less than rosy, but a less rosy financial picture than most of us on this committee have been accustomed to. A lot of us were not here. Some of us were, but for the last downturn. And I'm not saying we're in a downturn, but we're at a static state versus a growth state. And that's, that's different than what we've been dealing with for the past few years. So I have a lot of faith in this committee, in this body, in the House, in the Senate, and the administration. We will manage through all of these challenges we have before, and we will again. And we are in a good, strong position financially because of the way that we've managed in the past. These are not minor hurdles that we have to cover, to cross. They are significant, but I know that we can work together and get that done. Would appreciate, some focus on some of the things that the committee members have brought to your attention today. And we look forward to getting the report, especially on the ARPA spending, and can see where we are on that. And if there's any kind of feedback on the process in place with Ernst & Young, if there's any way to accelerate that, or, without losing the value of what we're paying them to do, then I certainly hope we would look for ways to get this money out the door a bit faster. And again, I think we can be grateful to the treasurer and to other folks who have invested dollars wisely. We have these interest earnings that we can use to allocate towards these expenses that we're being faced with unexpectedly. That's certainly going to, help our cause. But thank you. We look forward to having another budget hearing after the budget, when we actually have the document to look at, and hearing from you all again, and maybe we can do some follow-up on some of these things at that point. Without objection, we are back in session. Is there any other business to come before the body? Chairman Williams would like to share with the committee the definition of sartorial. He looked it up. He didn't trust me to know what I was talking about. Chairman Williams.
Thank you, Chair Lady. I will say that I had to look it up because I did not know what the fine Chair Lady was talking about. But sartorial means of or related to a tailor or tailored clothes. So it was a compliment. I didn't know it was. It's still a merino wool jacket.
This meeting has rapidly devolved. Without objection, we are adjourned.